Chapter 19 The Cursed Painting, Antony's POV. Almost as soon as he woke, Antony remembered the way he'd exploded in front of Theodora and Hanyu and had to stifle the urge to scream into his pillow like a child. Why did he have to keep embarrassing himself? The snoring from beside his bed, softer and gentler than usual though it might have been, told him that he'd awakened before his offering. Good. It had been strange to wake yesterday and find Hanyu staring down at him, the longing on his face as naked as the rest of him. Antony supposed that he should have been alarmed to awaken to such a sight, but he hadn't been. It hadn't even crossed his mind. Hanyu might have been huge and frequently naked, but he was no danger, even if it hadn't been for his human weakness. Antony stepped carefully around the boy, wincing at the slick string of drool that slid down his cheek. Humans really were disgusting sometimes. He washed and quickly braided his hair, wondering as he did whether he'd be able to find an excuse to arrange Hanyu's again when he woke. Perhaps they could work on his painting some more. For the time being, he needed to write to Claudia. He picked his way around Hanyu's sleeping form, catching himself right before he stepped on one of the boy's outflung hands. Shit! He found his head buzzing unpleasantly. He had to steady himself against the wall for a moment, chanting profanities in his head as his mind played over what had nearly happened. There would have been a soft crunch under his boot. Thanks to Marcus, he was intimately familiar with the sound and feeling of breaking hand bones, so it was easy to imagine. Next would have come Hanyu's response, and that was less predictable. Would his eyes have flown open, wide and wild with confused agony, and then the cries began? Or would his anguished scream have started before he was even fully awake, his eyes still closed as his voice lifted in protest against the pain that had shattered his peace? Every one of those thoughts twisted Antony's stomach until he felt sick. How long did a body cling to the memory of all the things it could no longer do? Antony could not vomit, and his heart could not pound, and he could not hyperventilate, at least not without a good deal of effort, but the idea of breaking Hanyu's fingers made him feel like doing all three. Further proof, he supposed, that despite his immortality, this damn brat was going to be the death of him. He passed Hanyu with exaggerated care. Once he was seated safely at his desk, he yanked the drawer open with more force than was strictly necessary, but gentled his movements as he withdrew the box and the papers. If he damaged the enchanted documents, no one would be able to repair them. He himself certainly no longer possessed the necessary magical skills. That was another thing his body sometimes had trouble remembering, even after all these years. "Dear Claudia," he began, and hesitated. Maybe it was the after-effects of his near miss, but he found his head was full of news of Hanyu. He wanted to tell his sister about the boy's conversation, about fixing his hair, about how he looked sleek and gorgeous as a panther in his fine painting silks until he opened his mouth, about his panic over using Antony's name and the sweet, hesitant way it sounded in the boy's mouth, about the way they had cringed together when Chihiro had insulted Theodora. That was stupid. Claudia didn't want to read a full page about Antony's offering of only 2 weeks. His next impulse was to write about Marcus, but he didn't want to think about his lover right now, in the safety of his own room with Hanyu snoring in the bedchamber, let alone write about him. "I've given Theodora the coordinates you sent me." That was the most important information to pass along, after all. "She says we'll be there soon. Whether we'll find anything is another matter, but of course you know that. I wish I'd taken more prisoners in our raid in case we do track the idiot down and he's running low on humans as well as elves. I suppose if worse comes to worse, we can escort his ship to the mainland and help them run a raid of their own on one of the desert tribes. Still, I'd rather not. You know how I hate to take non-combatants, much to Marcus's disgust, of course." Antony stared down at his barely touched vellum for a long time before sighing gustily and giving up. "Lately, I've been spending much of my free time painting my offering, Hanyu." Hanyu's POV. After Hanyu finished his breakfast, Lord Antony sat him down for another painting session. Hanyu minded these a lot less now that he and Antony talked all through them, and it was easy to stay perched on the edge of the sofa, leaning towards the god's seat. "You said you enjoyed singing and reading, didn't you?" Antony asked as he took up his brush and squinted down at his canvas. "And recitation, yes." Hanyu was flattered that his master had remembered. "I was surprised about the singing," Lord Antony said, and Hanyu flushed, feeling embarrassment tighten his stomach. "Sorry, my lord," he mumbled. "Oh, come now, it's not a tragedy. I'm not going to throw you out because you aren't musical." "I know," Hanyu sighed, "but it's so nice to listen to music. I enjoyed your playing very much, and I wish I could return the favor." "Well then, you can sing and recite for me. I wouldn't order Iovita to navigate and then get pissy when they ran us off course." "But you love music, Antony!" Hanyu hated how whiny his voice sounded. The god, on the other hand, seemed to find it amusing as he let out a surprised snort of laughter. I do, you're right, he said, smiling as if he couldn't help it. So, if you're going to pout about it, I'll have you sing for me later. Hanyu didn't like to admit it, but that did make him feel better. I'm really not a bad singer, he rushed to assure Antony. It's just my fingers that are clumsy. Shit, that was the wrong way to say it. What if the god assumed he was a bad masseuse, or worse, a bad lover? I'm sure, Lord Antony said placatingly. What kind of songs do you like? Hanyu laughed at that. Bad news, my lord. My favorites are, what did you call them? Soppy love ballads? The god groaned theatrically, which made Hanyu laugh harder and break his pose. Antony scowled at him until he stopped laughing, ducked his head with an embarrassed grin, and settled back into place. Really? Lord Antony complained as he set back to work. What makes those songs enjoyable? They're beautiful, Hanyu said, and so romantic. I like the ones where they fall in love at first sight, like they're so right for each other that their souls speak to each other the first time they meet one another's eyes. That's stupid. You can't fall in love just from looking at somebody. No, you can't. You also can't cleave an enemy in half with a single blow like they're always doing in the battle songs, but I don't see you complaining about that. The god's eyes flicked up to meet his, and Hanyu was suddenly nervous that his bantering had gone too far and verged into disrespect. He tacked on a hasty, My lord. I can, Lord Antony said. At Hanyu's nervous, confused look, he clarified. I can cleave with a single blow and all that. Oh. Hanyu might have felt foolish if it hadn't been for his rush of relief that his master wasn't angry. Right, of course you can. That makes sense. What I can't do is see someone's soul at a glance or any of that rubbish. I don't think you're supposed to take it so literally, Hanyu replied. He still felt a little shy, but if the god hadn't found him disrespectful yet, he would probably be able to get away with more arguing. The songs exaggerate the way it feels when you meet somebody and connect easily. They exaggerate everything. I suppose that's why I like them, really. Hanyu fell silent. He didn't want to go on too long and annoy Lord Antony. After a moment of quiet, though, his master looked up at him again and said, Yes, can you explain? He could. Well, maybe it's just because I've never been particularly important, but I enjoy thinking about someone loving me so dearly that they do deeds or make journeys or fight battles for me, or pine away into stones because they can't have me. I know it's all exaggerated and a little silly, but don't you think it's romantic, my lord? Not particularly, Antony said, keeping his eyes fixed on the canvas. I also like to think of being a lover, Hanyu went on, to feel so deeply for someone that I would die without them. That isn't how it works, the god said. His voice was low and tight, and Hanyu felt that it was time to stop pursuing this particular line of conversation. Maybe not for gods, he said with a dismissive shrug. Then he had to admit, maybe not for humans either. I guess I wouldn't know. I've never been in love before. Have you, Antony? Yes. Antony wasn't painting at all anymore, only staring hard at his canvas. With Lord Marcus? And others, a long time ago. The god's voice did not invite further questions. Shit, now Hanyu had done it. So much for his efforts to change the subject. He dredged up unpleasant memories again. How did a god manage to have so many experiences that made him miserable to remember? Couldn't he protect himself from everything that might hurt him? Hanyu had things he didn't like to recall. Fights with friends when he'd spoken cruelly, unkind things that had been said to him, punishments he'd received, times where he'd taken a joke too far and truly hurt someone's feelings, but nothing that would make him look so flat and desolate. He cast about desperately for something to say. Sometimes I used to wonder if I was in love with a sow, he blurted at last. It wasn't a closely guarded secret, but he still blushed to be talking about his silly, confusing emotions with a god, especially one who looked so somber and ancient as Lord Antony did just then. I love to be with him and sometimes get worried and jealous if I think he's going to want someone else for his best friend, and he's certainly very beautiful, but I don't think that was ever quite it. It worked. Antony looked up, engaged in their conversation again rather than whatever memories he'd fallen into. It can be an awfully thin line between friends and lovers, he said, and sometimes no line at all. What do you mean? Well, we're rather casual about sex among ourselves, Antony explained. The gods, I mean. There are established relationships like myself and Marcus, or Miss Alina and Iovita, or Julia, Thaddeus, and Cloelia. But even for us, there's a lot of sex with friends that just stays as that, sex with friends. I think I've been with every god on this ship at least once or twice. Hell, even Theodora tried me out once on a whim, and the only use she has for a man's cock is something to grab and twist during a brawl. Hanyu winced and drew his legs together. So, you and a sow, the god said. Have you ever been together that way? Sexually, I mean? Of course not, Hanyu snapped. How could Lord Antony just sit there and so casually accuse him of that? Didn't he think that Hanyu was capable of behaving at all? Humiliated tears flooded his eyes. For goodness sakes, boy, there's no need to take my head off over it, the god said sharply, throwing a quick glare over the edge of the canvas. Shit! He'd snapped at his master. That wasn't acceptable, no matter how his feelings were stung. Hanyu slipped from the sofa and bowed, repentant. He wished he was allowed to request punishment as he'd been taught. Please forgive my disrespectful tone, my lord, he said, hating how high and teary his voice came out. Damn it, the god sighed. There was a rustling, then some footsteps. Hanyu sensed Lord Antony settling in front of him. Is this painting cursed, boy? Are you going to end up bowing and crying every time we work on it? Sorry, Hanyu managed. You don't have to apologize. The god's voice softened, losing its edge of annoyance. Come on, Hanyu, sit up. Let me see you so we can talk about this properly. Hanyu obeyed, though he wished he didn't have to. He felt too ashamed to lift his chin and meet his master's eyes, but when a chilly finger touched his chin and tilted it gently up, he didn't have much choice. Look, Lord Antony ordered, you can see for yourself that I'm not upset. He could. The god was kneeling down and looking somberly up at him, but there was no anger on his face, and his lovely silver eyes were soft and concerned. Hanyu felt the knot in his stomach loosen, and his tears slowed. I'm not sure what exactly I did to frighten you just now, Antony said carefully, and I'd be grateful if you could explain it to me. I snapped at you like I do a dozen times in an hour, and you went pale and started crying. What was different from usual? It wasn't what you did, my lord, Hanyu said. He wanted to lean back on his knees so that he wouldn't tower over Lord Antony, but he couldn't bear to put any additional distance between them. It was what I did. I snapped at you. And I'm not sure what I did to cause that, either, his master said. But we'll get to that in a minute. For now, you're snapping. I'm so sorry, my lord. I know it's Hanyu's frantic tumble of words were cut short as Lord Antony held up a hand. I know it's not exactly protocol, the god said slowly, and this isn't a situation I've encountered in some time. It's been many centuries since an offering spoke angrily to me. Hanyu felt himself flush in shame. Centuries! That could be as many as 100 offerings, maybe, and not one of them with as little self-control as he had. But I find that I'm not terribly bothered by it, Antony continued. In fact, I would prefer to know if I've upset you, so I suppose we'll add snappishness to the list of things that aren't permitted in the presence of others, but which you're allowed in private. Thank you, Hanyu said automatically. His mind was whirling over the implications of this permission. Frankly, he felt a little scandalized, and he was offended all over again that the god would think he'd continue to be angry and snappish in the future. There was no time to sort out his feelings on the subject because Antony was still talking. I still don't see how I angered you in the first place, he said. I understand if you have a painful history with the sow, but simply asking whether you've ever been intimate seems like a fairly innocent question. Is it taboo among humans these days? Peering at the god's face, Hanyu hedged a little. Not as such. As he searched the god's face, which stayed open and confused, Hanyu found himself flushing anew. Why hadn't it occurred to him that Lord Antony just didn't know? Why should the god concern himself with the minute of his offerings' lives? Because he seemed interested in the minute of Hanyu's. Could he have been wrong about Eiji? Did Lord Antony truly not speak with the others the way he did with Hanyu? Selfishly, he couldn't help being pleased by the idea. We are trained for sexual service, he said finally. Professionals come to the temple to conduct those lessons. Other than that, sex and romantic relationships are not permitted for us. Such entanglements might complicate our service to the gods. Lord Antony's face pinched. Oh, he said. Then, really? The jokester part of Hanyu's brain desperately wanted to say, I have better things to do with my time than make up lies to tell you, but he quashed the impulse. Yes, he said instead. Didn't you order that? I never did, Antony said. I'll have to ask my siblings. Hanyu watched nervously as the god's face cycled through several expressions, finally settling on one that looked surprisingly downcast. He hadn't meant to displease him with the information. That seems very sad, his master said at last. I'm sorry I insulted you by thinking you might have had relationships, but I wish you hadn't grown up that way. I'd like to abolish that rule going forward. I didn't mind, Hanyu assured him. It was true, he hadn't. There had never been anyone he wanted for more than a week or so, and though he'd liked his lessons in intimate service, he'd been content with his hands for release. He knew other boys had chafed at the restrictions, and there had been plenty of secret pairing off. He'd always seen the sense of the rule. If he and Asao or Jen had been lovers, how miserable would they be now? Still, the god rubbed his forehead for a moment, then looked back up at Hanyu. I wish you'd had a chance to fall in love. I could fall in love with you. The words popped into Hanyu's mind unbidden, but with such perfect clarity that he knew they'd been lurking on the edge of his conscious thoughts for a few days at least. It would be an insane thing to say to a god, even to one who didn't refuse all humans. Hell, it would be an insane thing to say to anyone he'd known for 2 weeks. But there it was. It wasn't just that he liked the prestige of belonging to the Lord of the Gods, though of course that was part of it. He liked being near Antony. He liked that his master permitted their bantering with each other, and he even liked the way the god fussed and grumbled harmlessly at him. He liked the way Antony looked after him and tried to remember his need for food and sleep as if he owed Hanyu something. Shamefully, he liked the liberties that Antony permitted him, and the fact that he apologized to him sometimes, and he liked the way those things broke down the barriers between them. He liked falling asleep knowing that Antony was nearby. He liked the way Antony looked very much, and the way it felt when he touched him and complimented him. He liked the way Antony made him feel special and chosen and beautiful. He knew that all those things didn't add up to love, but maybe in time they could. And that was all right. It was perfectly natural and acceptable for an offering to fall in love with their god, as long as they never expected the god to love them back.